You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is author, historian Paul Dickson. I stumbled upon his book while I was perusing the bibliography of another book, ordered it, and I'm damn glad I did. The book we're discussing today is called Sputnik, The Shock of the Century. And if my opinion that it's a terrific read, a great piece of history, doesn't convince you to pick it up, then perhaps this person's will. Paul Dickson's indefatigable research and reportorial lucidity, you get that, have given us a fascinating history of the event that forever changed our world. And that was written by Walter Cronkite. Mr. Dickson, thank you so much for coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You've written so many books and really in an interesting number of categories. What compelled you to take on this topic?
I wanted to do this for a long time. I had actually seen, when I was in 1957, when Sputnik went up a few days after it was up in space, I was at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. And I was listening to the radio station from New Haven, WELI, which is a reference to Yale University, Eli, WELI. And the radio, they said that with the Sputnik to be visible in Middletown at sundown about at the next morning or the next evening. And I went up on the football field where there was very little ambient light. And I was standing there in the field with a couple other guys. It was an all-male college. And I saw it go across the sky. And it was like being at the Battle of Hastings or at the firing on Fort Sumter or something. It was literally, and we knew it, myself and a couple other people who went up there to see it. It was just this slow thing across the sky. We thought for decades that it was actually the Sputnik itself is actually the missile, the vehicle that went with it. And it was, you could see it at sun up and sundown because as the sun was on the horizon, it reflected against the thing in the sky. So it was like a little blip of light going across the twilight sky. And when the day it actually went up, the moment it went up, I was walking across the campus, same place a couple of days earlier. And a guy said to me, he said, the Russians have just put a missile in space.
For those of us who are, born in the post-Sputnik era and see space achievement as a space station, walking on the moon, satellites, Hubble telescope that go, all this amazing space exploration, it's hard for us, and you do a very good job of it in your book. It's hard for us to imagine what Sputnik meant back in 1957. Can you talk a little bit, please, Mr. Dickson, about what was happening in the space race, or how this started the space race back there almost 70 years ago?
In 1955, 56, 57, there was a major event that took place in the world called the International Geophysical Year. And that was an attempt. There were scientists and others who were very concerned about the fact that the Earth was getting in trouble, carbon and other things. And so there was this international effort to study the planet Earth and its problems and take a basic physical of the Earth. There was a scientist named Robert Kaplan, who was the American head of the International Geophysical Year, who earlier in 1957, before Sputnik, had warned that by the year 2020, we were going to face massive problems with carbon. There was going to be disastrous climate change, oceans rising, and that one of the reasons we were going into space was to measure the health of the Earth. And he talked specifically about global warming. This is in March of 1957 in a speech in Santa Monica. And so the United States and Soviet Union were doing things like putting people on Arctic research vehicles, researching the Arctic. And both the United States and the Soviet Union were planning or talking about putting up a satellite. And of course, we were laughing. It was hysterical to us that the Russians would be able to do that. The big joke was we didn't have to worry about a Russian suitcase nuclear weapon because the Russians couldn't produce a suitcase or a decent suitcase. And out of this, we were marching along. We had some capabilities, but in the sort of unknown to the public, Eisenhower was shying away from going with the sort of the rockets and things that had come out of the World War II, the Nazis V2. And what was not evident to everybody at the same time, that the difference between a rocket and a missile was the payload. The missile was to carry a weapon. The rocket was to be used for exploration and peaceful things. Out of the blue, in October 4th, 1957, we were, on one hand, we were working with the Russians scientifically. On the other hand, we were really afraid of what the Russians were up to. They were testing missiles. They were about to explode their first hydrogen bomb. Their missiles were getting more and more powerful. And when Sputnik went up, it was almost as if everything came together at one point. And we were, as a country, even the Western civilization was just in shock that the Russians could do this, because not only was it the satellite, which was this little harmless 184-pound piece of metal that's going in Earth orbit, going beep, but it was, once that was up, it also meant that the Russians had the ability to send a missile into downtown Omaha, Nebraska, that for the first time, our whole concept of our protection, North America's protection by two oceans, went out the window. And we always felt our Navy could protect us from an invasion. But all of a sudden, in a matter of minutes, both coasts were penetrated by this harmless satellite.
You mentioned a few minutes ago in your answer about President Eisenhower, and I want to get to him specifically here during the podcast. But his attitude about how we're going to make progress in space, and would it be fair to describe it at some point after World War II and before Sputnik, the United States made, which I'll call a devil's bargain, which you can refute, please, and that is the association and the importation of Nazi rocket scientists, especially Wernher von Braun, to the United States. Was it worth it?
Oh, it was probably worth it in the sense that it was, but probably more importantly, was we brought the V2s with us. In other words, we took tons and tons. Basically, the missiles that we were using were basically the V2s, and they were using spare parts. Bringing those guys was a huge moral dilemma. Von Braun's, he was at Dora, the concentration camp at Peenemünde, and they were starving people. They were using mostly members of the French resistance to build these V2 rockets and V4s. They were working on the V7, but the Von Braun and his company really picked up almost everything they were doing from Goddard, who was an American scientist. Mm-hmm. And he later won some lawsuits, or his family, against the government, because a lot of the stuff the Russians, the Nazis had packed up, they very clearly said came from Goddard. Well, it was worth it in the sense that it got us going. Von Braun was a very difficult character. In fact, he had fought with Eisenhower. Eisenhower was afraid of him because he wanted to turn space into a weapons platform. And one of the reasons was when Eisenhower, in November of 1957, decided that he was going to build a civilian space agency, Von Braun actually went out and attacked him publicly and in speeches, saying that he was jeopardizing national security, that the space was meant for warfare. And Eisenhower had taken a page from President Truman, who had the atomic bomb and refuses to give the atomic bomb to the Army or the Air Force or any other military unit, and created his own civilian department, the Atomic Energy Commission. And I think both decisions were crucial in saving us from a more deadly outcome of the Cold War.
We're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is author, historian Paul Dickson. We're discussing his book, Sputnik, The Shock of the Century. The book has been called Powerful, Thoughtful. Susan Eisenhower, granddaughter of President and General of the Army Dwight David Eisenhower, says Dickson's book not only presents a thoughtful analysis of the impact Sputnik had on the dawning of the space age, but also serves as a valuable resource for understanding the historical context of the debates now taking place on issues such as national missile defense and the future of space. Mr. Dickson, you mentioned Robert Goddard, a few minutes ago. I was actually stationed in the Army at White Sands Missile Range, and there was plenty of Robert Goddard stuff there. Who was he? How important was Goddard's research and experiments to what became the rocket, the space age?
Oh, I think he was the key figure. I think he was way ahead of his time. He was condemned by almost everybody for some of the things he made. He said he was, among others, the New York Times said he was a fool and had to apologize the day after the moon landing, apologized to Goddard for calling him a visionary and without any practical.
I love that part of your book. That is so good. Sorry, go ahead.
And it was Von Braun and all the rest of the Nazis were basically, they were buying his papers. He was getting money from the Smithsonian, and he was publishing papers on rocketry. And then the Nazis, or the pre-Nazis, the rocket people in Germany were buying these, going to the government printing office and buying these documents from Goddard, in which he explained the principles of space flight and went back and pretty much proved the physics of their possibility. But so he was key to everything. It was American.
And when was his, so I'm going to say heyday, but when did he really come into prominence? Because I think it's important for the Leaders and Legends podcast audience to know how far ahead of his time he was.
He really starts in the 20s and 30s, and in the 20s and 30s. And he's conducting experiments in Worcester, Mass, and he's actually building rockets. If you go on any of the NASA websites and things, they show pictures of some of the rockets he built and what he did. And his writings are quite really fascinating to read, because he writes in a very clear, non-scientific English that people can understand. But
let's mesh two things very quickly, and that is the end of World War II, which most people are pretty familiar with, in the sense that actually we're recording this on VE Day, May 8th, and Harry Truman's birthday. Happy birthday, Harry Truman. And so we have a situation where World War II is ending. The wartime coalition, the Allies, Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States, the coalition is splintering. Clearly, there is an eye to the future, and in what became the Cold War, but certainly wasn't the Cold War yet in 1945. How did all of this mesh with American monopoly of atomic weapons and the race for space? Because you bring that together in your book in a way that really puts the person in 1940s, 1950s Earth.
There was a tremendous fear on the part of the United States that the Russians were going to gain not only the rocket technology, but the atomic secrets and basically put them all together and become powerful thermonuclear power. And we had, of course, had the atomic bomb at the end of the war, and we used it in Japan. And we were just so fearful of the Russians. So when Germany falls, and we're all trying to get to the rocket base at Peenemünde, which is where the concentration camp Dora was in the northern part of England. And there was actually John F. Kennedy's older brother was killed trying to destroy the rocket base at Peenemünde. And it was also known that the Hitler was working on a V-7, which was a missile that was intended to destroy New York City. And there was no question in Hitler's mind that would be a great accomplishment, because he saw New York City as the greatest Jewish city in the world, with a large Jewish population. And it would also turn the tide against the United States in the war. So there was a whole lot of reasons. And everybody knew pretty much what was going on, because the V-2s had been fired into Belgium and England, and there were great destruction in London and such from the V-2s, and in Antwerp and other cities. And so there was a race to get to Peenemünde and get the hardware that was lying around, all the rocket casings and the rocket engines, as well as the scientists, as well as and then more commonly engineers. Let's go back to that thing. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. Most of them were engineers, actually. But what happened was, and von Braun knew, the last thing he wanted was to be taken by the Russians. So he gets in his car, and he and his brother head south so they can surrender the Americans. And the Russians come in and grab some other guys, not quite the same ones, but probably lesser scientists. They had their own secret guy that was very good, but he doesn't come out until much later. We don't even know he exists. But there's a huge, and we bring tons and tons of rockets pieces back to the United States, and they get the Russian and the Nazis in through Mexico. They bring them to Boston first. They have them in Boston Harbor, and von Braun used to actually go drinking in Boston at some of and discuss space. The thing about von Braun, which is so fascinating, was when he first surrenders, they sent a guy from Wisconsin out to meet him who speaks perfect German. And von Braun's English is flawless. He's wearing a cape, but he's got a cane. He looks like a French movie star. He's suave, and his English is almost perfect. And he immediately starts talking to the guy that's capturing him and his interpreter about fishing in Wisconsin and walleyes and things like that. But again, there was a race, and of course there was espionage going on both sides, and the famous case of the Rosenbergs, who were executed for stealing nuclear secrets, which is some of that still being debated as to their innocence or guilt, but it was a very real thing, the espionage itself. And so there was a lot of tension, and the tension was building as the Russians made it known that they were going after the whole concept of missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and nuclear warheads. And so the tension right before Sputnik was huge. And it was an odd time. We were solving polio. We thought we were doing very well in post-war, becoming better and better. But then right in the month before Sputnik, there was a huge a flu epidemic that killed about 70,000 people. It was really early. It wasn't until late, but there was a huge sort of fear of this flu that was killing people. The month before Sputnik, there was Eisenhower to send the 101st Airborne into Little Rock to integrate the schools. And that was very controversial. A lot of people felt that Eisenhower had gone in with a heavy hand and using the most elite part of the American military, 101st Airborne and the paratroopers. And they were probably the most beautifully disciplined of all the units he could set in. And there were actually people who said, well, he should have just sent in the National Guard. The Arkansas National Guard may not have been the great group to send in there at that point. But,
True. You bring up the United States. Let's talk a little bit about that, because what comes through in your book was, and we'll connect it to the Sputnik launch here in a second, was a feeling of a criticism of that Americans were lazy. They were obsessed with luxuries, refrigerators and cars and all those things. Our education system was not as focused as it perhaps could have been or should have been. And this is all in comparison or relative to what was perceived to be the Soviet Union's discipline and, you know what, we don't need all the luxuries. We're going to spend all of our energies on space and engineering and education. So there was a real sort of soul searching among Americans and American leaders about what our priorities should be as a country in the 50s. And Sputnik in 57 really hyperbolized and accelerated these arguments. Is that fair?
Absolutely. In fact, and of course, the Russians were the first to notice that. And they would say, and this was the era of these gargantuan tail fins on cars and these Edsels that look like somebody sucking a lemon, and all these Princess phones. They were selling Princess phones as a great accomplishment. All it was a pastel telephone. And the Russians basically went out and said, all you Americans care about is your big cars and your tail fins and that kind of thing. And there was within the country, there was a feeling of we were going in a shallow sort of way. We were not going in the direction of true progress, that a lot of things had to do with just fancier goods and superficial things.
But there was an argument, wasn't there an argument also in the sense that we deserved it? We just saved the entire world from dictatorships and ended the Holocaust and all this. Darn it. It's like going on vacation when you finish a semester of college, like I've earned this, and you're scolding us for reveling in the benefits of our triumph. Is that a fair counter argument?
Absolutely. And we had done some remarkable things, notably the Salk vaccine, which was basically for the world, and the Sabin that came after it, the two vaccines for polio, which are created not by big government programs, but by basically independent inventors or scientists working on their own with the small grants from universities. And so we're doing some amazing things in terms of, and of course we've done what we've done. The other miracle of post-World War II was the Marshall Plan. We basically saved Europe. We basically went in there with American dollars and saved Europe. And so there were all these things we were doing that were amazing. And even when Eisenhower came in, he was building the interstate highway system. And I did some research of that at one point. One of the reasons Eisenhower everybody now says he was doing it for the purposes of defense. Well, there's actually a letter that he writes to one of his fellow generals when he's pushing the highway system. And he said, the other reasons was there was so many people dying on 2-lane blacktops that there were some Labor Day weekends when we lost all our Americans in traffic accidents that had been lost in minor battles or military incidents in World War II. And so we were doing all these things, but I think a lot of people harked back to those superficialities. And it was comic in a way because we were doing a lot more in terms of basic science and but we were also doing a lot less. Now, on the flip side of that, when we started looking into the Soviet Union, Betty Friedan is a writer at that point, and she starts writing about a feminist, known today as a feminist.
And Feminist Mystique. The Feminist is a famous book, is a famous book.
And she made the point forcefully that the Russians were educating huge numbers of female engineers, huge numbers of women in medicine and in the sciences, and that we were wasting this resource of our women. And we were caught short on some of these things. There was no question that other people, that we were falling short in such areas as that. And also our education system, where a lot of people are claiming that a lot of the sort of Dick and Jane approach of education, still teaching Latin and Greek in high school, and we should be teaching Spanish and Chinese or something. And there was a lot of educators were looking for reform at that time.
Let's talk about, I want to ask one more question about the United States and then switch over to the Soviet Union for a few minutes before we tie it all together here in the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest is historian and author Paul Dickson. We're discussing his book, Sputnik, The Shock of the Century. There was, in a sense, let me say it a different way. Let me ask, was there a sense in the United States in the 1950s that there was nothing that we couldn't do or accomplish, and that if any great things were going to be done or accomplished, they would be done by the United States in a free society, in a democracy? And the launch of Sputnik in October of 57 shattered this complacency, this worldview.
Absolutely. It was, the subtitle of my book is The Shock of the Century. And it was. And even people in the know, even people who knew that we had some capabilities that were keeping on the sidelines at that point, knew that we were ready for this. The shock was, in fact, positive for it, shaking us out of our sort of almost arrogance after the war, that we could do anything we were, and the whole idea of the Soviet Union, it was a brutal place, and Stalin was a death machine unto himself. But we also were not ready for this to happen. And I think when it did, it had great positive things eventually in this country. And I think I'm going to jump ahead for a second, but I think one of the things that was recognized early and which led us into the space race, which I think, I'm not a thesis person, but I think my own impression is that it's helped keep us out of the hot war. John McCormack, as Speaker of the House, and several other leaders latched onto the idea that a race into the moon, a race into space, we could become a surrogate for thermonuclear war. It would be a massive competition. There would be some deaths, but they would be heroic deaths of astronauts, and there would be a great push in technology, which you get in wartime. There'd be a great push in technology, but there would be a glorified version of war. There'd be a winner and a loser, but there wouldn't be the millions of carcasses in the aftermath. And I think to a large degree that is one of the things. I think also that Khrushchev was the leader of the Soviet Union and not a more bellicose leader. I think that also enabled the Russians to get on that same train, that this is the great noble battle. Now, they thought they were going to win.
Along with the Olympics and chess and other sorts of endeavors that were metaphors or substitutes for, as you mentioned, a hot war in Europe or Asia, did Khrushchev, because he was different than Stalin, did he embrace this competition between the United States and the Soviet Union? Did he enjoy the fact that he had one-upped or beaten the United States to the punch? Because Khrushchev is an interesting, vulgar, ebullient character, and those are the three words I can think of at the moment.
Yeah, but he had a lot of things, and he had a lot in common with Eisenhower. And there was after the book, even I did more reading and research, and I actually at one point was involved in a public debate with Sergei Khrushchev, his son. And I think what I came away with was the fact that he was a veteran, B, he understood Eisenhower, C, he had his own fight with his generals. His generals were basically pushing him towards war and pushing him towards nuclear destruction. And he basically veered totally away from that and became, even as a public figure, he became a person who was fearful but public. He might say, "We will bury you," or "Well, your aircraft carriers are nonsense." His son actually claims he never banged his shoe at the UN, but that's another thing. But it was, and I think he and Eisenhower understood each other. They were both great World War II vets. They both had leadership in the World War II. And I think he didn't want to see his country destroyed. I think he had every reason. And his son actually told me that. And he said as much. He said, my father did not want to see the country that he loved destroyed. And I think the fact that Eisenhower, by keeping the space away as not a military weapons platform, and Khrushchev keep together, I think they were the perfect two leaders to do this. And I think one thing is about Eisenhower was a nuclear abolitionist. If you read his writings and some of the things he wrote or said in the National Security Council meetings, he didn't believe in fallout shelters. He thought they were a trick against people believing they could survive nuclear war. But he was an absolutist.
Let's talk about Khrushchev. I want to ask one quick question about that. You mentioned it. Khrushchev not wanting to see his country and his countrymen suffer. And how much of that was founded in the fact, or had its genesis in the fact, that Khrushchev had already seen his country and his countrymen suffer because of the Nazi German invasion in June of 1941. It's incomprehensible, I think, to most people, let alone most Americans, the hateful slaughter that took place in the Soviet Union during World War II.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think he also saw what Stalin and his crew did, and the purges and the things that were going on. I think he wanted to veer away from that. He wanted to create a consumer economy of sorts. He wanted to build cars, he wanted it to become part of the century. And I think that's very clear.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmond Construction, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Our guest today is author Paul Dickson. We are discussing his book, Sputnik, The Shock of the Century. You mentioned him, so I want to read his endorsement of your book, and that's Sergei Khrushchev. Sputnik is an insightful look at the way Sputnik changed the world, especially the United States, boosting its education and research. Sputnik essentially awakened America and started its space era. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think by also just what happened, and I interviewed physicists and engineers who basically, when they were in their car, one in particular was in his car listening to the radio when Sputnik goes up, and he realizes he's got to go back to graduate school and got to become a physicist and got to get involved in this. And it was, for science, it was just this moment of realizing there was a whole lot to be done, and it wasn't all for warfare. It was for exploration. It was going to the moon. It was going to Mars. And the places where it was celebrated was Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Places like that which were already working in this. And to this day, if you look at Jet Propulsion Laboratory and these magnificent vehicles they've sent to Mars and Venus, and which are crawling all around these planets, sending back an unimaginable amounts of data and discovery. And I think that to a lot of people, a lot of even universities, that opened up all of a sudden. They saw what was going on. And Eisenhower got a lot of money spent for getting kids out of really brilliant kids and getting them to the high technology schools. Eisenhower's early money, a lot of money went to getting women into the sciences. And it was, the reaction instead was not hostile in the sense it was creative, that Eisenhower, in a large degree, marshaled that energy and created a whole lot more money for just education and higher education and discovery.
You mentioned a few minutes ago, and you discuss it in your book. Could the United States have put an artificial satellite in space before the Soviets did with Sputnik?
Absolutely. The guys at Huntsville, von Braun, General Medeiros, were all set to go. But Eisenhower did not want, Eisenhower saw the International Geophysical Year as a period of, as a peaceful moment of coexistence between the United States and the Soviet Union. What he was afraid of was that if the United States military was behind the satellite and it was using Nazi equipment, Nazi V2s, etc., and he actually forbid them from developing it, they actually hid some of the equipment for putting up that satellite. And we, in the meantime, we were trying to put up the Vanguard, which was American developed. It was, in a funny way, it was a genius discovery. It was the first thing to use integrated circuits as opposed to vacuum tubes. And we ended up sending up the Army one. It was our first thing in space, but this was after several Vanguard disasters. But there's still one of the Vanguards is still up there, and it's still making it. They made some major discoveries with the Vanguards, but once we got going, it was just amazing how fast I think in the planetary stuff is where we just left the Russians in the dust. And at one point, in terms of the space race itself, there was a gentleman at the Library of Congress whose job it was to keep track of the two countries in space. And I asked him right after the moon landing, I said, how come we won? And he said, it all boils down to two words: quality control. That we learned how to produce 10,000 integrated circuits without a failure. And whereas the Russians never understood the religion almost of quality control in manufacturing. And they just never.
And it's got more as the next stage of exploration required exponentially greater technology, the more we leapt ahead. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think Eisenhower also grabbing space away from the generals and the vision of weapons platforms, I think by pushing, and he poorly pushed hard and may have himself put up the first communication satellite. His vision for space was as a relay point for communications. Our phones are all coming bouncing down out of the satellites. And so he envisioned the Arthur C. Clarke's vision of space as a liberation or a liberation in terms of communications and things like that.
Is there any evidence or argument that President Eisenhower purposely allowed this and encouraged this shock to get the United States out of its complacency?
No, there's not any evidence, but there is the suggestion that he was willing to allow that to happen so that we could prevail in the end. In other words, if we had gone up with the United States Army satellite rocket, that would have sent the whole tone of the IGY off. And so I think he was prepared for what was going to happen. I think he saw that, but I don't think he looked at it as a sacrifice per se. But one of the things I found in my research was the Russians actually came to us at one point for Sputnik for a mass spectrometer, and we turned it down. And that request and our answer was then classified as secret. And it was through the Freedom of Information Act when I was doing the book that I was able to get that document. But the other thing I have to remember is Sputnik was extraordinarily low technology. The battery was a truck battery. The beep 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 was a truck battery. One of the reasons we could see it was buffed every night with sheepskin, so that it would be reflective. The whole apparatus would be reflective. It was basically JP5 kerosene that was the fuel. It was not a very sophisticated instrumentation. It just beeped. It didn't have any.
We talked about technological limitations I am technologically limited, but I'm going to see real quick, Mr. Dickson, if I can play the beep. Hold on 1 second and make sure. See, tell me if you can hear this, and I'll know I've done it correct. Did you hear that?
No, sorry.
The Sputnik beep. You didn't get to hear it. Let me try it again.
Okay. Somehow it's not picking up.
No, that's all right. That's all right. We'll skip this part. Let me ask you a question about on October 4th, 1957, Sputnik is launched. How does the world begin to know what has happened?
Oh, I think the world got to know what was happening because of the fear, because of there was especially among older people, especially among the legislatures and others who wanted, some members of Congress wanted to shoot it down. To them, it was the Russians were now winning the atomic missile race. And I think that fear created some really strong reactions, headlines. And the ironic thing was, being a college kid at the time, a freshman in college, the younger people were all brought up on science fiction and everything. And we looked upon it as a great breakthrough, a great moment of our time has come. All the things we read about when we were 12 and 13 years old was now coming true. And the older you got, the more you were concerned that it was really the end of things. And the younger you were, you saw it as the beginning of things.
On a tactical level, how did word spread? In other words, I think that some people were given a hint or heads up that something's going to happen, but on a scientific and a ham radio, almost grassroots level, how did word spread that something magnificent had happened?
One of the things that Russians had done earlier, and this again was involved in the scientific nature of the International Geophysical Year, they had published in ham radio magazines and other journals the frequency on which their first satellite would go up. And so they're all over the country. When it goes up, there are kids, and seriously, who had ham radios who would show up and start playing it. And there was a huge thing at the Texas State Fair, which is going on October 1st, 1957. Some kid shows up with a ham radio, and there are people dropping by to listen to Sputnik on the ham radio. It was to a lot of people in the world, it was just it was the beginning of space, and it was, and of course a month later you have the Russians put up the dog Laika, and that's just even bigger because the whole world is, oh, this poor little doggy up in space, and he becomes almost like a Disney character, and people didn't know at the time he was probably dead on the launch during the launch, but it was worldwide. So everybody saw it, and it was seen as the beginning of the space age. It was like, we've just fought the Battle of Hastings.
How did the rest of the world react? In other words, these non-aligned countries, and there was all these proxy battles, both hot and cold, for influence in the world. How did other countries react to this Soviet achievement?
The Soviets at that time were brilliant in terms of propaganda. And one of the things they would do was they would announce that, realizing there were still federal troops in Little Rock, Arkansas, to integrate schools, and the Russians would announce that the time at such and such an hour that the Sputnik would pass over Little Rock, Arkansas. They would announce that there were, in America, they would go, especially in Africa and the third world, they would make a big deal of the fact that while we're doing this for humanity, America has to send its elite armed forces unit into racially integrated high school. And the Russians used that. They used that we were the bigoted people. We were the people who couldn't even honor our own citizens who were black. And that really flew overseas. And we were, the United States of America was really, it was a hard thing to rebut. It was to say Little Rock wasn't real. The glory of Little Rock was Eisenhower's decision not to mess around. Just, I'm sending my best guys in there. We're going to integrate.
Exactly. So looking back, the final question before We ask the same 5 questions of all of our Leaders and Legends podcast guests, looking back the past decades with a non-jaundiced eye. Was the overreaction, let me say it a different way, was there an overreaction to the Soviet achievement of Sputnik, or was the reaction proportional and propelled us to what I think anyone would say is ultimate victory in the space race?
I would say the latter. That it was a strong reaction, but there were people waiting for that reaction. There were educators, other people waiting to reform things. And I think it was the perfect reaction in the sense that it got us where we are. It got the world where it is. It got us into the whole thing of satellite communication.
We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Distinguished historian and author Paul Dickson, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Number 1, what was your first job?
My first job was as a paper boy, delivered papers. And I guess about the same time, I also ran a little group of people that cut other people's lawns and rake their leaves. But I had a gang of people working with me. So that was
Number 2, what was your first
concert? Oh, the first one I paid for, you wouldn't believe this, but it was Johnny Cash. I was a kid. I grew up in New York, and I was a great fan of country music. And there was a station. There were a lot of GIs who came back from World War II loving country music, Hank Williams and country, all those guys. And so what happened was, as a kid, after the war, I was listening to country music. There was one station in New York, actually in New Jersey, that carried country music. And then all of a sudden, one day, they're announcing, my father had to drive me, and they're announcing that this new sensation for some records, they were still S78s, Johnny Cash was coming to White Plains, New York. I went and saw him. It was his first time north of the Mason-Dixon line. And I actually got his autograph, which I lost many years later. But
no. Oh, that's so good. But we've not had that as an answer. I've done 270 podcast interviews, and I think this is our first Johnny Cash reference. Third question. If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Any book? Oh my gosh. Wow, that's a really difficult question. I suppose I would pick, just because I just always loved it so much. I thought Grapes of Wrath, it's not narrative nonfiction. It's not, but it just affected me and that and The Great Gatsby, I think, are the two that most affected me growing up.
Number 4, these questions get harder as they go along, but you've only got 2 more left. Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Oh my gosh.
These are designed to shock people out of their complacency.
For me, that's easy. I suppose it would be the Gettysburg Address.
That's a very popular answer. You got an A+ on that one. Okay. Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
Barack Obama.
The most popular answer. You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends, LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister, an Indianapolis legend whose first historical memory was the Lindbergh flight in 1927. Our guest today, author-historian Paul Dickson. His book, Sputnik, The Shock of the Century, is essential reading to understand the Cold War, and in some ways, why the Cold War never became hot. Mr. Dickson, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Your book is wonderful, and I really enjoyed the discussion.
I really enjoyed this. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.